Okay, and our afternoon keynote presenter is Dr. Elder Albert McLeod. He is a Two-Spirited. He's from Two-Spirited People in Manitoba and Manitoba HIV-STBBI Collective Impact Network Stewardship Team. The title is Why and How Do We Pivot Our Responses to the HIV-STBBIs in Light of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Girls Two-Spirited Inquiry National Action Plan and Pathway Forward. One of my mentors and friends of mine, here we have it for Dr. Elder Albert McLeod. Take it away, Albert.
Thank you, Jackie and Linda. I'm just going to go into the share slide if I can find it here. Here we go. So further to Dr. Lavallee's earlier presentation around how historic barriers compromise Indigenous health in the 21st century. There are tools and mechanisms, and whether it is new technology like the rapid testing or the dry blood spot, there are mechanisms in place that our government, federally and provincially, are undertaking to begin to prevent these situations. And in this case, it is the violence against Indigenous women and girls. And Dr. Lavallee characterized that the discrimination against Indigenous people in health is a form of violence. Maybe not overt violence, but also it does harm. Now, this presentation is based, I just need a time check. I got 15 minutes, I think, which I could do. And this is the inquiry report that was released in June of 2019. And it's called Reclaiming Power in Place, the final report on the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. So on December 2015, the federal government announced the National Inquiry as a key government initiative to end the disproportionate high levels of violence against Indigenous women and girls, and as we know now, Two-Spirit gender diverse people. So in the Indigenous culture, North and South American, and we have to understand North and South America were separate from other parts of the world for thousands of years. So this relationship between colonialism and Indigenous knowledge and philosophy is relatively new, 500 years. But what Indigenous people believe is that every child has a purpose, a role, a destiny, and possess a divine gift. This philosophy applies to LGBTQI Two-Spirit people who also come from the spiritual world. To negatively interfere with the life journey of Two-Spirit people is a social and cultural taboo among Indigenous peoples around the world. So here we have what I like to characterize our ancestral grandmothers. These are Cree women of North America. They were very much the greeters of the early colonists and helped the early colonists understand where they had arrived and how to survive the various seasons. This is transgender Lahamana, who is Zuni, and her name is Wewa. Biological male lived and presented as a female among the Zuni people, and she was the tallest of her people, as you can see in this particular photograph. So when we think about the harms of the past and really the poor ideas about forced assimilation of Indigenous peoples, and really the unethical treatment, particularly of Indigenous children through Indian residential schools. This is Guy Indian Residential School, Sturgeon Landing First Nations, which is an hour and a half north of the Paw. And these are children removed from their parents who are being forced to learn about living and understanding a foreign culture that is not theirs. And so church and state worked hand in hand for over 100 years, and they manipulated the minds of these children to influence them that their culture, their language, their knowledge was really invalid, in many ways pagan or devil worship, and that the only way to success is to conform and assimilate to being white. This is a closer image of what is known as Father Lacombe's ladder, where on the right you see the depiction of the Indigenous heretic heathen experience ending up in death and hell. And at the very bottom, you see the priest moving with this family into this form of assimilation and conversion into Christianity, ultimately becoming saved in the ideals of colonial society. Now, for Indigenous peoples, there was very complex and sophisticated understanding of gender and sexuality and sexual orientation that were embedded with land-based knowledge and spiritual teachings. And they created artificial deities to petition the natural world for rain, good harvest, those kind of things. And those are the ultra male and female. And we have to realize these social constructs that were developed to communicate with the natural world. As a result of colonization, we have a very binary colonial idea of what are socially sanctioned roles in our society, which really polarizes the genders and creates this tension, inequality, and violence. Now, the inquiry report was launched 2 years later, in June 3rd, 2021, and the one on the left is the actual action plan. The one on the right is the Two-Spirit one, and they're available online. The Métis, the Inuit, the First Nations all did an action plan, and they are available at this website below, and I'll send that to Lori to share with the attendees. So in the National Action Plan development, and this is the pivoting from the Truth and Reconciliation line for calls for action, and that was for Canadians, right? Not so much the Indigenous experience, because we already knew what happened, but really for Canadians to know what happened and to shift that relationship with Indigenous peoples. So it is not as damaging in terms of the poverty, the homelessness, the illness, all those kind of things. Now, the National Action Plan development had 9 sub-working groups, 3 of which were led by Manitobans, the Two-Spirit one, the Urban one, and then the Family and Survivors one. Now, out of my experience in this process, it came to my mind what we were actually doing and what we wanted to say to Canadians. And this is what came to my mind, that Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people are indispensable to the future of Canada as a nation. Now, this idea certainly would receive some pushback because, again, people would say, well, why you, right? And really, in the beginning, this is how it was before colonization occurred. And during the early years of colonization, that settlers were very dependent on Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people to make, what we have today. Further, Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people possess inalienable, inherent, treaty, Inuit, Métis, universal, constitutional, and civil rights. So in terms of the National Action Plan, and there's funding that is slowly being released to community organizations to begin this work of decolonization and reconciliation. And here's an example for Women and Gender Equality Canada. And it's increased capacity of Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people to address gender-based violence. And you can see that it is for organizations, Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people. Now, another fund from CINetwork, which is another federal department, is the Wellbeing Fund. And you can see 3 projects that were funded in Manitoba at Ganiganichik, MKO, and Manitoba Moon Voices. So this is new money. This is the pivoting. This is the turn, right? This is community development, community capacity building to strengthen the voice of Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people. And when we look at HIV, again, as we saw this earlier slide that shows with HIV from the Manitoba HIV update in 2020, that for Indigenous females, injection drug use or sharing of drug equipment is the major driver of HIV for women in Manitoba. In terms of looking how many women in Manitoba, and we know most of the HIV positive women in Manitoba are Indigenous women, and of that group, we know most of them are First Nations women. So when you look at the data or the EPI data, women who entered in care in Manitoba over the last 6 years, 208 were newly diagnosed cases. So these are women who came forward had some idea they might be positive or were symptomatic and got tested and learned they had HIV. The ones introduced to care were tested somewhere else in Canada. And then there's a small group that still needs to be classified. So in the last 6 years, 283 women in Manitoba were introduced to care, HIV care. And this is my little scribbling note here of how I managed to go to the website and pull some data by myself to share this at the CAN conference last week at the Fairmont Hotel. Roger Roulette is an Ojibwe language specialist and doing a deep cultural dive in understanding Indigenous language, ceremony, culture, and life philosophy. Roger is an amazing specialist who helps us do that. And how we're going to do this is through understanding that we live in a very material world. When we see Indigenous peoples, we have all these stereotypes and presumptions about fluff and feathers, also the introduction of pan-Indianism, and then we are more Western today on how we demonstrate our culture. For example, my name is Roger. So Roger recommends experiencing demonstrative culture, which is we begin to learn, remember, practice the expected norms, social norms of Indigenous people, how we look at each other, how women sit, male gender roles, the space we give each other, then the ability to quickly establish meaningful relationships. And that's usually accomplished by a stale joke. So you always got to have a collection of stale or lame jokes on hand if you're going to quickly establish meaningful relationships. As well, in terms of kinship terms, even though we have our biological families, we name and adopt other people around us, could be chosen family as relatives, and they're just as important and just as respected. In the old days, we needed to establish relationships for cohesion to create a feeling of safety. So I'm a granddad and I'm a grandma to many people. I'm a mama to many people. And then Roger also says that 90% of the Indigenous identity is directed towards the prevention of illness and misfortune. So again, bucking those stereotypes about, being at risk, where the alternate is actually the truth. We're experts in prevention of illness and misfortune. And then the understanding of Anjanawan, which is payment for more wrong, doesn't necessarily come from another person. It could come from just your social interaction or from the spirit world. So 3 facets. A, folklore. It tells us about the world, our personal teaching styles, and how we are in the world, the do's and don'ts. For example, don't eat berries with a fork. And also, if you put your shoes on the wrong backwards, you're going to meet a bear on the road. Traditions. They're passed from one generation to the next, distinguishes one group from the other, tells us who we are, and then the discussion of taboos are incorporated into legends. They're heard before the age of 10. Serious discussion followed, for example, taboos around incest, and then they should be talked about through storytelling. And that's been a constant thread to our conversations today. So we had an experience of demonstrative culture a couple of years ago. I was going up to the PAW with my friend Cheryl Croxon, and we invited Dr. Rusty Solomonov to join us. And surprisingly, he did. So we went on this fabulous journey into the north to the PAW for a few days. And we went up on number 6 highway, and then we came back on number 10. So we made a complete circle. And here you see Rusty enjoying the Manitoba landscape. And then along the way, we also saw this bald-headed eagle in the trees. So again, this is that expression or practice of a demonstrative culture, is that we may have new technologies around STBBIs, but we need to get out of the lab, we need to get out of the clinic and really engage with the community people where they reside. Also, the development of peer engagement with the success of the Sisters of Fire, who are very upfront and involved in the CAN conference at the Fairmont. They have their own website. So challenges and barriers, confronting colonial structural incremental genocide. anti-Indigenous racism, institutional racism, patriarchy, toxic masculinity, and colonization 200, which is what we are experiencing right now. And again, the CINetwork actually has a model around ethical space exploration. So we've developed that intersection between mainstream and discrete Indigenous experiences. And the Indigenous sector is not identified or yet populated with those approaches, but that's a work in process.
1 minute, Albert.
I'm good. So there's opportunity. There is the International Indigenous Pre-Conference on HIV and AIDS in Montreal, July 26 to 28, as well as the International AIDS Conference, which I know some of us will be delegates at this July, early August. And the powwow coming up tomorrow, so you get to practice your demonstrative culture, take your coffee and your lawn chair and find the powwow and enjoy yourself. So we will always love and need love through the stages of our lives. Thank you. That's it.